In the dimly lit county auction house, just outside Missoula, Montana, time stood still. Lying motionless on the cold concrete floor was a German shepherd. His scarred body spoke volumes of horrors that no words could ever capture. Once he had been a proud military dog. Now, he was nothing more than a broken shell of what he used to be. He didn't even lift his head as sneers and whispers filled the room. "Not worth a dime," someone muttered. "Damaged goods," another added coldly. The auctioneer's voice trembled with desperation. "Starting bid $50. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Until a chair scraped across the floor in the back row. A young man stood up, his worn Marine Corps jacket hanging loose around his shoulders. His face was half hidden in shadow. But his voice, steady, haunted, sliced through the noise. "I'll take him." The room went silent. No one knew it then. But that single moment would change everything. Leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's continue the story. Ethan Walker had seen more than his fair share of broken things. At 34, his calloused hands and distant eyes told silent stories. Stories of battles fought far from home. It had been 3 years since he'd returned from his last deployment with the Marines. But the war still followed him. In the sudden noises that made him flinch. In the cold sweats that soaked his sheets each night. The small Montana ranch he'd inherited from his grandfather. It had become both his refuge and his prison. Every day followed the same routine. Coffee at dawn. Tending to the few horses his grandfather had left behind. And fighting off memories that refused to fade. The local VA office called often. But he never picked up. Their voices just echoed through his answering machine. The medication they gave him? It sat untouched in the bathroom cabinet, collecting dust. That morning, he hadn't planned to go to the auction. But something in the local paper had caught his eye. Former military dog. Aggressive. No training possible. Final auction before euthanasia. 6 short lines. But they made his hands tremble. With a rage he hadn't felt since Afghanistan. The dog's story was written in his scars. Military dogs were meant to retire as heroes. Treated with dignity. But this one. His ribs showed through a patchy, dull coat. His wounds hinted at something far darker than honorable service. The harsh fluorescent lights exposed it all. Marks. That could only come from systematic abuse. But it was the dog's eyes that struck Ethan hardest. He recognized that empty stare. It was the same look that greeted him in the mirror every morning. The look of someone who'd seen too much. Done too much. And broken under the weight of it all. In the corner stood Claire Thompson, the local vet. She had tried quietly to help the dog. But bureaucracy and military red tape had kept her hands tied. Now, she watched Ethan with cautious hope. Could this broken soldier really save a broken dog? Or would they only shatter each other further? The paperwork took less than 15 minutes. No questions asked. The background check cost just $200. And a liability waiver Ethan signed without even reading. The ease of it all made his stomach churn. A military service dog, sold off like used furniture. "He's all yours," the auctioneer said, handing over a worn, fraying leather leash. "Though I'd recommend a muzzle, he's been unpredictable." Ethan approached slowly. His boots echoed across the concrete floor. The dog didn't move. But Ethan saw it. The tension in his body. The ears flattened just slightly. He'd seen that look before. In the eyes of soldiers, right before an ambush. Hey, buddy, he said softly, crouching 6 feet away. I'm Ethan. I'm not going to hurt you. The dog's eyes flicked toward him. Just for a moment, there was a flicker of awareness. Ethan stayed perfectly still. His training with military canines kicked in. Never approach head-on. Never move fast. And above all, never show fear. Claire Thompson, the veterinarian, stepped forward. His records are incomplete, she said quietly. He's been here 3 weeks, won't let anyone touch him, barely eats. Ethan nodded, never breaking eye contact with the dog. What's his name? They've been calling him Zero. Her voice was tight, bitter. Because that's what he's worth to them. Ethan shook his head slowly. That's not your name anymore, he told the dog. We'll find you a better one. What happened next, no one could agree on. Not Claire, not the auction staff still lingering near the walls. The dog lunged. A blur of motion, teeth bared, aiming straight for Ethan's throat. But Ethan didn't move. Not an inch. Their eyes met. And in that split second, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Or a shared understanding of pain. The shepherd's jaws stopped. Just inches from Ethan's neck. Hot breath, a mix of fear and fury, filled the space between them. Then, slowly, the dog backed off. The fire in his eyes replaced by something else. Confusion. Jesus Christ! Someone whispered behind them. He should be put down. He's too dangerous. No. Ethan's voice was calm, steady, final. He's coming home with me. Getting the dog into his truck wasn't easy. The shepherd wouldn't move. Frozen with fear, body like stone. But Ethan didn't push. Didn't pull. He just sat beside him. Right there on the concrete floor. He spoke in a low voice. Telling the dog about his ranch. The open spaces. The quiet mornings. The horses. The cold coffee at dawn. 1 hour passed. Then 2. Mr. Walker, the auctioneer called. We're closing up, if you can't handle him. We'll leave when he's ready. Ethan's voice left no room for argument. It wasn't before sunset that the shepherd moved. One cautious step forward. Then another. By the time they reached the truck, he was walking beside Ethan. Not trustingly, but willingly. Claire watched them drive off. The setting sun casting shades of purple and gold across the Montana sky. Good luck, she whispered to herself. Though she wasn't sure if she meant the man, or the dog. Either of them knew it then. But this was more than just a rescue. It was the beginning of something bigger. A story that would uncover secrets buried deep. Challenge military systems long left untouched. And prove that sometimes, the only way to heal is by helping someone else find their way back to the light. The first night at the ranch. That first night tested them both. Man and dog. Ethan had prepared the old barn carefully. Fresh straw, clean water, a safe space. But the German shepherd refused to go inside. He stood just outside the entrance, frozen in the shadows. Trembling. His eyes locked on the enclosed space. As if it held something far worse than the outside world. All right, Ethan whispered. We'll do this your way. They spent that night under the stars. Ethan sat on the porch steps. The dog kept his distance, watching him from near the fence line. Either of them slept. When dawn broke over the Montana mountains, Ethan noticed the food bowl was still full. Untouched. Dr. Claire Thompson arrived early that morning. Her truck kicked up dust as it rolled down the gravel driveway. "How was the first night?" she asked. Her eyes shifted between the uneaten food and Ethan's exhausted face. "We're adjusting," he replied, his voice raw, worn from hours of quiet talking to a dog that wouldn't come near him. "The veterinary exam?" Impossible. The moment Claire reached for her bag, the shepherd's body changed. His hackles rose. A low growl rumbled from deep within his chest. When she took a step forward, he backed himself into the fence, teeth bared, eyes wide with panic. "This isn't fear-aggression," Claire said softly, stepping back. "This is trauma. Whatever they did to him involved medical equipment." The rest of the day, Ethan tried to create some sense of routine. Each time he approached, he was met with either a flash of aggression or complete shutdown. The shepherd would lunge, then retreat, pressing himself into corners, shaking uncontrollably. By evening, exhaustion was setting in. Frustration, too. The dog hadn't eaten in over 24 hours, wouldn't allow anyone near him, and showed no signs of progress. Ethan's phone rang. It was Claire, checking in. "Sometimes," she said gently, "if they're too far gone." "He's not too far gone," Ethan interrupted. His eyes followed the shepherd's slow pacing along the fence line. "He's just lost, like I was." That night, the storm rolled in from the mountains, and that's when the real challenge began. The first crack of thunder shattered the silence, and the shepherd broke. In a blind panic, he slammed into the fence. Blood smeared his shoulder. Then he bolted. Toward the property line. Toward escape. Toward whatever he thought was safer than here. Ethan ran after him. Rain pouring down, soaking through his jacket, mud grabbing at his boots. The shepherd's dark form vanished and reappeared in flashes of lightning, almost ghost-like in the chaos. They covered nearly 2 miles before the dog cornered himself in a drainage ditch. Trapped, terrified, Ethan approached slowly, and then sat down, right there in the mud, rain pounding his face. And he began to talk. "I know what it's like," he said softly. "When the thunder sounds like mortars. When every shadow looks like a threat. When you can't trust anyone. Because trust got your friends killed." The shepherd's ears twitched. His gaze locked on Ethan. "But you can't live there forever. In that place where everything hurts. Trust me. I've tried." Hours passed. The storm raged, then calmed. Neither of them moved. And then, as the first light of dawn cut through the gray clouds, the German shepherd took a step toward Ethan. Then another. He didn't come close enough to touch. But something had changed. Something had shifted between them. And they walked back to the ranch together. 2 broken warriors. Separated by species, but united in their pain. It wasn't a breakthrough. Not yet. But it was a beginning. A week after the storm, Claire Thompson arrived with news that would change everything. She carried a thick manila envelope, her expression grave, as she sat down at Ethan's kitchen table. "The military finally released his records," she said quietly. She opened the folder, spreading out pages marked with official seals. "His real name is Rex. He was deployed with the Marine Corps. Afghanistan. Special Operations Command." Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for the papers. The German Shepherd, now called Shadow, for his habit of following at a distance, watched from his usual spot near the door. 3 combatants, Claire continued. Highly decorated. But then something happened. The records are heavily redacted. There's a 6-month gap where he just disappears from official documentation. Ethan scanned the pages. His jaw clenched. These training logs, he said, pointing at a section. Look at the timestamps. They were running him 20 hours a day. He shook his head. No dog can sustain that. There's more. Claire hesitated. She pulled out one final document. The dates of his last deployment. They match my last tour, Ethan finished, his voice barely above a whisper. He stared at Shadow. And suddenly, memories came flooding back. He was there. The day we lost Baker's team in Kandahar. The revelation hung heavy in the air. Shadow's ears twitched, as if something in Ethan's voice stirred a forgotten memory. And for the first time, he moved closer to the table. On his own. Someone wanted him forgotten, Claire said softly. Military dogs don't end up in civilian auctions, Ethan. Not like this. Not with their records sealed. Ethan stood abruptly, startling Shadow, who backed into the corner. Who handled him? He asked. Who was his last commander? Claire shook her head. Those pages are completely blacked out. But I do have a contact at the Pentagon. Willing to help, unofficially, of course. As they talked, neither of them noticed Shadow's growing agitation. It wasn't until he let out a soft, high-pitched whine, a sound of distress, that they turned to see him pawing at his neck. Ethan approached slowly, speaking in calm, reassuring tones. And for the first time, Shadow didn't retreat. Under the thick fur at his neck, Ethan's fingers found something. Metal, buried beneath the skin, grown over. Call the clinic, he told Claire. We need to see what that is. That evening, under careful sedation, Claire removed a military identification tag from Shadow's neck. The numbers were partially worn away, but one name remained. Major James Harrison. Ethan's face went pale. Harrison. That's impossible. He was investigated for ethics violations. Discharged 3 years ago. You know him? Claire asked. Everyone knew him. He ran the enhanced training program. Ethan's voice turned hard. There were always rumors about his methods, but nothing was ever proven. Ethan looked at Shadow, still groggy from sedation. Their eyes met. And this time, there was something new behind the shepherd's gaze. Recognition. And fear. Whatever had happened in those 6 missing months, whatever had been done to this dog, it led all the way up the chain, to the highest ranks in the military canine program. What are you going to do? Claire asked quietly. Ethan's answer was immediate. Find Harrison. Whatever Shadow went through, he deserves justice. Neither of them could have known then that this decision would put both their lives at risk, or that the truth they were about to uncover would shake the very foundation of military canine programs across the country. The breakthrough came quietly, on a still Sunday morning, 3 weeks after discovering Shadow's military ID. Ethan had fallen asleep in his porch chair, the weight of another sleepless night pressing down on him. His nightmares had kept him awake for hours. He was jolted awake by the sound of whimpering. Shadow lay in the yard, caught in the grip of his own night terrors. His legs twitching, soft cries escaping his throat. Without thinking, Ethan began speaking, using the same calm voice he'd once used with broken soldiers in the field. "You're safe now. It's just a dream. You're in Montana. On the ranch. The war is over." Shadow's eyes snapped open. But instead of the usual explosive reaction to being startled, he stayed still, watching Ethan. And something was different this time. There was focus behind those eyes, an intensity that hadn't been there before. For several long moments, either of them moved. Then, slowly, Shadow stood up. He climbed the porch steps and sat down. Not close, but near. Close enough to choose to be there. Ethan nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Yeah, I get them too," he said gently. "The dreams where you're back there. Where you can't save them. Where everything goes wrong." Shadow's ears twitched, tracking every word. His body relaxed, bit by bit, though his eyes never left Ethan. So Ethan kept talking. He shared pieces of his own story. The ambush that took his team. The endless nights in rehab. The guilt that never really let go. Later that morning, Dr. Thompson arrived for her weekly checkup, and she froze at the sight before her. Ethan, calmly reading the paper on the porch, and Shadow, lying quietly at the bottom of the steps. Not touching, not entirely relaxed, but sharing space, peacefully. "This is remarkable," she whispered, keeping her distance, careful not to disturb the fragile peace. "What changed?" Ethan didn't look up from the paper. "We recognized each other," he said softly. "Sometimes that's all it takes." The rest of the day brought small, quiet shifts. Shadow took food directly from Ethan's hand, though he still retreated a few steps to eat it. When a car backfired in the distance, he didn't bolt. Instead, he moved closer to the porch, to where Ethan sat. Each choice, each response, spoke of a growing trust. Hard won, and still delicate. That evening, as Ethan prepared Shadow's dinner, the phone rang. It was Claire's contact from the Pentagon. The call was brief, but the impact, immediate. When Ethan hung up, his shoulders were stiff, his breath shallow. Shadow sensed the change instantly. His ears perked, body alert. "They found Harrison," Ethan said quietly. "He's working for a private military contractor, training dogs for overseas security companies." Ethan clenched his hands against the counter. Still hurting them. Still getting away with it. Shadow stepped closer, drawn by something in Ethan's voice. And for the first time, he allowed Ethan to see it. His vulnerability. The slight tremor in his legs. The way his ears lay flat at the sound of Harrison's name. Ethan knelt down, met him eye to eye. "I promise you," he said, "he'll never hurt another dog. Whatever it takes. We're going to stop him." Shadow held his gaze. And in that moment, their shared trauma became something more. A mission. A purpose. A chance to make sure no one else, human or animal, had to suffer the way they had. The German shepherd straightened his back. Just slightly. A ghost of the soldier he once was. That evening, as night fell over the ranch, Ethan made a decision. He opened the front door and left it wide open, Shadow stood in the yard, watching silently. "It's your choice," Ethan said. "Inside or out. You're not a prisoner here." Minutes passed. Then, with deliberate steps, Shadow climbed the porch and entered the house. He didn't settle, didn't relax. He stayed alert, near the exit. But he had made a choice. To trust. Even if only a little. That night, for the first time since his arrival, both man and dog slept. Without nightmares. The following week brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah Baker, widow of Lieutenant Michael Baker, from Ethan's last deployment, arrived unannounced one crisp morning. Shadow's reaction was immediate and astonishing. Instead of the usual tension toward strangers, the German shepherd approached her slowly, his tail low, but not tucked. Sarah froze on the porch. Tears welled in her eyes. "That's him, isn't it?" she whispered. "Mike's last letter mentioned the dog. Said it saved 3 of his men before." Her voice broke, faded into silence. Ethan watched, as Shadow gently pressed his head against her hand. The gesture was careful, intentional. It took Ethan's breath away. Sarah sank to her knees, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. And for the first time, since arriving at the ranch, Shadow accepted human touch, without hesitation. "He remembers," Ethan said softly. "Military dogs never forget their people." Over coffee, Sarah shared what she knew. Her husband's last letters had voiced concerns about the training program. Specifically, Major Harrison's methods. "Mike was gathering evidence," she explained. "He said something wasn't right. Dogs were disappearing after showing signs of behavioral issues." Shadow lay at her feet, but his ears twitched at every mention of Harrison's name. The trembling returned to his legs. Then, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. "He gave me this. Said if anything ever happened to him, I should keep it safe. I never opened it." Inside the envelope, they found photographs, handwritten notes, training logs showing impossible schedules, documentation of enhanced stress techniques, and the most damning of all, records of healthy military dogs being labeled unstable right after reporting injuries from training sessions. Ethan scanned the documents. His face hardened. "He wasn't just abusive," he muttered. "He was breaking dogs. On purpose. Then having them eliminated. To protect himself." Suddenly, Shadow stood. He moved to the window. Body stiff. Alert. A black SUV had pulled up at the far end of the long driveway. Even at that distance, Shadow's reaction was unmistakable. Sheer terror. "Get in the back room," Ethan said quickly. He gathered the documents. "Call Claire Thompson. Tell her to bring the files." Through the window, they watched 2 men step out of the SUV. Civilian clothes. But wrong posture. Wrong vibe. Shadow growled. But this growl was different. Not defensive. Protective. He moved, positioning himself directly between Ethan and the door. His training fully engaged. When the knock came, Ethan opened the door, just enough to block their view inside. The men smiled politely, identified themselves as private security consultants. "Interested," they said, "in military canine contracting." In acquiring retired military dogs for overseas work, one of the men said smoothly. We heard you recently obtained a German Shepherd. We'd be willing to offer substantial compensation. Behind Ethan, Shadow's growl deepened. But this time, it wasn't just fear. It was defiance. This is private property, Ethan said calmly. And he's not for sale. Mr. Walker, the second man stepped forward. Some dogs are too valuable to retire, surely you understand. I understand perfectly. Ethan cut him off. I also understand that harassing a retired Marine and attempting to illegally acquire a former military asset are federal offenses. He stepped forward, voice like steel. Would you like me to call JAG? Or the local police first? The men retreated, their smiles gone. But their message was clear. This wasn't over. After they left, Ethan found Shadow in the kitchen, pressed against the cabinets, shaking violently. He didn't speak right away, just sat down on the floor nearby. A moment passed. Then, slowly, Shadow moved closer, until his body leaned against Ethan's leg. Just for a moment. But it meant everything. Shadow had chosen comfort over retreat. They won't touch you again, Ethan whispered. Not while I'm breathing. From the back room, Sarah emerged. Her face is pale, but her eyes are full of fire. Mike died trying to expose this, she said. We have to finish what he started. Ethan looked down at Shadow, who now stood alert by his side. The shepherd's eyes were sharp. Focus. This wasn't just trust anymore. It was something deeper. A partnership. They had moved beyond victim and rescuer. Now, they were a team. The threat escalated. 3 days later, Claire Thompson arrived just before dawn, her vet truck stirring dust in the cold morning air. She looked shaken, and she was carrying another manila envelope. 3 more military dogs from Harrison's program, she said softly. Recently euthanized at a private clinic. She laid out the medical reports on the kitchen table. All labeled as aggressive and untreatable. All within the last month. Shadow, now comfortable enough to sleep in the kitchen, lifted his head at the sound of her voice. His ears pricked forward, listening. They're cleaning the house, Ethan muttered. Destroying the evidence. Before we can expose them. Claire nodded grimly. My contact at the Pentagon says Harrison's firm just landed a major contract. They're linking trained dogs to military contractors worldwide. No oversight. No regulation. Before they could say more, a sharp knock rattled the front door. Shadow was on his feet instantly. But something had changed. Gone was the trembling, traumatized animal. In his place stood a military working dog. Focused. Readied. Through the window, they saw a man in a suit. Formal, composed, holding up a badge. FBI. Special Agent Marcus Reynolds, he said, once they were seated in the living room. His expression was grave. Mr. Walker, we've been investigating Major Harrison's training programs for over a year. Lieutenant Baker was our confidential informant. Before his death, Shadow positioned himself between Ethan and the agent, watching every move, reading the man's body language like a battlefield scan. What we didn't know, Reynolds continued, was that Harrison had identified the dogs, the ones who witnessed the worst abuse. He paused, letting the words sink in. He's been systematically eliminating them. To cover his tracks. The room fell silent. Your dog, Reynolds said finally, may be the last surviving witness. Ethan felt it then. A cold, steady anger settling in his chest. How? 27 dogs, Reynolds said quietly. In the past 3 years. All highly trained military assets. All suddenly declared unstable. And eliminated. He paused. His eyes settled on Shadow. But he made a mistake with this one. He got careless. From the corner, Claire spoke up. The embedded ID tag. The one we removed from Shadow. Reynolds nodded. It contained a GPS tracker. That's how Harrison's men found you. But it might also prove, he continued, that he was monitoring dogs even after their official discharge. Which is a direct violation of military protocols. As they spoke, Shadow moved closer to Ethan. Not from fear, but like a soldier preparing to defend his team. His military instincts were returning. But this time, it was loyalty driving him. Not commands. Harrison has connections, Reynolds warned. High-ranking officials. Private security firms. Even political figures. They've buried investigations before. We need concrete evidence. What about Sarah Baker's documents? Claire asked. A good start, Reynolds said. But not enough. Then it happened. A sharp crack echoed from outside. Shadow reacted before anyone else. He launched himself at Ethan, knocking him away from the window. Seconds later, the glass shattered, raining down where Ethan had just been sitting. Reynolds drew his weapon, moving fast to secure the room. Claire ducked behind the kitchen counter. But it was Shadow who took command of the situation. The German shepherd moved methodically through the house, checking each entry point. Every movement is precise, controlled. His training was no longer buried. It had returned, fully awakened. When local law enforcement arrived 20 minutes later, they found shell casings in the tree line. A warning shot. Professional. Intentional. They're getting desperate, Reynolds muttered, holstering his weapon. Which means we're getting close to something they don't want found. That evening, after Reynolds and Claire had left, Ethan sat on the porch. Shadow sat beside him. Still, but alert. No longer just a victim. A protector now. By choice. You saved my life today, Ethan said quietly. Just like you saved those men in Afghanistan. Shadow turned to look at him. And at that moment, Ethan saw it. What Harrison had tried so hard to destroy. Not just a military asset, but a warrior's spirit. Unbroken. Despite everything. Tomorrow, Ethan continued, we start fighting back. Shadow's posture shifted. Straighter. Sharper. He had heard him. And understood. They were no longer just survivors and rescuers. They were soldiers again. But this time, in a battle of their own choosing. The transformation began in earnest. The very next morning, Ethan woke before dawn, to find Shadow already standing at attention by his bed. Fully alert. But calm. The German shepherd's eyes held a new kind of clarity. As if something long dormant had been fully awakened. We need to train, Ethan said softly. Not like before. Something new. Over breakfast. Reynolds called with a warning. Harrison's security firm had deployed teams across 3 states, systematically visiting homes where former military dogs had been placed. 2 more animals had been humanely euthanized due to alleged behavioral issues. Dr. Thompson arrived mid-morning. Her truck is full not only with medical supplies, but something else. Training equipment. If we're going to protect him, she said firmly, he needs to trust us completely. And we need to trust him. The rehabilitation process they designed was unlike anything used in military training. The protocols were different now. No commands. No force. They let Shadow set the pace. Trust had to be earned, not demanded. They began with the basics. Simple medical checkups. Before, even the slightest touch had triggered violent reactions. But now, with Ethan sitting on the floor beside him, his voice low, steady, Shadow let Claire approach. His body trembled. But he didn't retreat. The physical wounds are healing well, Claire said softly. Her hands moved gently across old scars. But watch how he reacts to certain spots. They use pain as a training tool. Ethan's jaw clenched. Show me where. Over the next hour, Claire pointed out the places where Shadow flinched. Pressure points. Where shock collars had been strapped. Areas where harsh correction had left more than physical damage. Every discovery fueled Ethan's determination. This wasn't just cruelty. It was systematic. And it had to be stopped. The breakthrough came that afternoon. Instead of barking out commands, Ethan spoke plainly. Would you like to check the perimeter with me? He asked. Shadow's ears perked up, considering. Then, on his own, he walked to Ethan's side. Together, they walked the ranch's edge. Ethan pointed out possible weaknesses. Gaps in fences, blind spots near the trees. And Shadow offered his own observations. Not through words, but posture, movement, stillness. This wasn't Handler, an animal. It was 2 veterans, working side by side. Sarah Baker returned that afternoon, with more of her husband's documents. She watched from the porch, tears quietly falling. Mike would be proud, she whispered. This is what military working dogs were meant to be. Partners, not tools. As the days passed, trust grew. So did Shadow's confidence. He began sleeping closer to Ethan's bed. Night by night, inches became feet. Feet became inches. Until one morning, he was curled at the foot of the bed. Silent, steady, safe. During the day, he patrolled the ranch. Not out of fear, but because he'd chosen this place and these people as his mission. The most powerful moment came during an afternoon thunderstorm. Before, thunder had sent him into panic, heart racing, eyes wild. But this time, as the first rumble rolled over the mountains, he pressed gently against Ethan's leg. It's okay, Ethan said quietly. We're safe here. Shadow looked up at him. And in that moment, Ethan saw something in his eyes. Complete trust. The dog had chosen comfort over flight. A small moment. But in the world of trauma recovery, moments like that were everything. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the storm drift away over the hills. Claire joined them, bringing news from her Pentagon contact. Harrison's company is hosting a major demonstration, 2 weeks from now, she said. A full showcase of their enhanced training methods. They're bringing in military observers, private contractors, even foreign buyers. At the mention of Harrison's name, Shadow's ears flattened. But there was no trembling, no fear. Instead, he moved closer to Ethan. His body language clear, ready. That's our window, Ethan said slowly. A public demonstration means witnesses. If we can expose what they're doing, we can shut it down for good. It's risky, Claire warned. Harrison's men are still watching the ranch. And Shadow. She glanced at the German shepherd. Are you sure he's ready to face this? As if in answer to Claire's question, Shadow stood. He walked to the edge of the porch. Posture straight. Head high. Every inch. The military working dog he once was. But now, there was something more. A dignity. Not born from obedience or command, but from healing. He's more than ready, Ethan said quietly. He's choosing to fight back. That night, for the first time since his arrival, Shadow made the move. He rested his head gently on Ethan's knee. The gesture was simple, but powerful. A soldier's way of saying, I've got your back. The story of Shadow and Ethan began to spread through the small Montana town like wildfire. It started with Mark Wilson, owner of the local feed store, and a Vietnam veteran. But from belonging, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the group gathered on Ethan's porch. Sarah Baker had brought her husband's dog Tags, which now hung proudly beside Shadow's new collar, a symbol of his true identity as a military working dog. Harrison thought he could erase what these dogs are, Cooper said quietly, watching Shadow stand guard at the porch steps. But he forgot something important. A warrior's spirit, human or canine, can be wounded, but it can't be broken. Not when there are people left. Who remembers what loyalty really means? The warning came at midnight, just 5 days before the demonstration. Agent Reynolds called, as Ethan and Shadow were finishing their final perimeter check. They've moved up the timeline, Reynolds said. His voice was tight with urgency. Harrison's people are mobilizing. We've intercepted communication. They're planning something within the next 24 hours. Shadow, already scanning the tree line. Suddenly it froze. His ears snapped forward, catching something in the darkness. Something human senses couldn't yet detect. Ethan moved fast, cut the porch lights, and plunged the ranch into darkness. Moments later, 3 black SUVs appeared at the far end of the access road. Headlights off. Engines quiet. Shadow's growl was low. Controlled. Not a dog's fear, but a soldier's warning. They're here, Ethan said into the phone. At least 6 men, maybe more. Local police are en route, Reynolds responded. But they're 15 minutes out. Can you? The call was cut off. Abruptly, Ethan checked his phone. No signal. They'd blocked communications. Inside the house, Sarah Baker, who had been reviewing files for the demonstration, was already moving. She activated the emergency alert system, the one James Cooper had installed. A silent signal, one that would reach every veteran who had pledged to protect Shadow. And Shadow, the German shepherd once discarded as unstable, now stood at the door, still and steady, Not trembling. Not retreating. But I'm ready. Shadow was locked in, focused on the approaching threat. But everything about him had changed. There was no fear now. No trembling. He moved with purpose, positioned himself in the shadows, using cover, just as he'd been trained in combat. Like old times. Like old times, buddy, Ethan whispered. Shadow's ears twitched. A quiet acknowledgement. They had prepared for this. They knew it would come to this. A direct confrontation. The first man stepped toward the porch. His stance was military, controlled. Mr. Walker, he called softly. Let's handle this professionally. Major Harrison simply wants his property returned. No one needs to get hurt. Property? Ethan's voice rang clear through the dark. Is that what you call the 27 dogs you eliminated? The evidence you've been destroying? Another figure stepped from the shadows. And the moment he spoke, Shadow went rigid. Major Harrison. He'd come to handle this personally. Those dogs were damaged, Walker, Harrison said coldly. Unstable, like that when you're hiding. They couldn't adapt to civilian life. We gave them a humane end. Shadow's growl deepened. But he didn't charge. He held his ground. Poise. Discipline. His military training, now guided by choice, not fear. Humane? Sarah Baker stepped onto the porch, her voice trembling with restrained rage. Like what you did to the dog that saved my husband's unit. Before you marked him for elimination? Harrison's laugh was sharp, hollow. Mrs. Baker. Still fighting battles your husband should have learned to avoid. How unfortunate. Then, headlights cut through the night. But they weren't from police cruisers. 3 more SUVs pulled up. Different this time. From the darkness, James Cooper's voice echoed loud and steady. Federal agents and local law enforcement are 4 minutes out. Harrison, you might want to rethink your position. He had seen Shadow's transformation firsthand. During his weekly deliveries to the ranch. That dog's got the look, Mark told his regulars at Wilson's Feed Supply. Same look our unit's dogs had. He's not just any rescue. He's one of ours. Word moved fast, especially through the veteran community. First came James Cooper, a retired Marine K-9 handler. He drove 3 hours to visit the ranch, leaning heavily on his cane. Major Harrison, Cooper said, his voice tight with restrained fury. I knew something wasn't right with his program. Lost 2 good dogs to his enhanced training methods. Both labeled unstable. Right after they started showing injuries. Shadow stood beside Ethan, watching Cooper closely. But this time, there was no fear. The old handler's presence triggered something else. Recognition. A kindred spirit. Claire had arrived early that day to document Shadow's progress, and what she witnessed left her stunned. Cooper sat beside the dog, speaking in that quiet, steady cadence only K-9 handlers use. Shadow responded immediately. Alert. But relaxed. No trauma signs. No flinching. Just trust. He remembers the good ones, Cooper said gently. The handlers who treated their dogs like partners. Not equipment. Harrison tried to break that out of them. But he couldn't. Not completely. The next visitor was Patricia Martinez. Her son had served in Afghanistan, with a military working dog of his own. She didn't come for Ethan. She came for Shadow. With real meat wrapped in foil. These heroes deserve the best. she said firmly, handing over the food. Shadow accepted the offering with gentle courtesy, his manners shining through years of trauma. Patricia wiped a tear from her eye. My David would have been here himself. But she didn't need to finish. They all knew the cost of war. The turning point in community involvement came when Sheriff Robert Davidson paid an unofficial visit to the ranch. He had served 20 years before joining law enforcement, and his department had its own K-9 unit. This stops in our county, Davidson declared after hearing the full story. Harrison's people might have connections, but they're not above local law. We'll set up patrols. Keep an eye on your access road. And true to his word, sheriff's vehicles began making regular passes by the ranch. Deputies would stop, chat with Ethan, let Shadow inspect their patrol cars. Each positive interaction built the dog's confidence. The local veterinary community rallied too. Dr. Thompson's colleagues began offering their services, creating a quiet network of safe clinics. Places where Shadow, and dogs like him, could be treated without fear of interference from Harrison's organization. Even the town's children played a role. The daughter of the local school principal, 9-year-old Emma Lewis, started a campaign called Protect Our Military Dogs. After hearing Shadow's story, she organized a bake sale and raised over $2,000 for medical supplies and security equipment. When Emma visited the ranch with her father to deliver the funds, Shadow surprised everyone. The once traumatized dog walked calmly to the little girl and accepted her tentative pat with quiet, dignified patience. It was the first time he had allowed a child to touch him. See? Emma said proudly. He's not scary. He's just been hurt. And now he needs friends. The community's support crystallized one Sunday afternoon, when James Cooper returned. This time, he brought a dozen other veterans with him. They gathered inside Ethan's barn, bringing tools, supplies, and decades of collective military experience. Harrison's demonstration is in 10 days, Cooper said, spreading out maps across a workbench. We've got people willing to attend. Document everything. But we need to make sure Shadow is protected until then. The veterans are divided into teams. Each one brings their own expertise. Former security specialists reinforce the ranch perimeter. Communications experts set up encrypted monitoring systems. Medical personnel established emergency protocols. And through it all, Shadow moved among them with growing confidence. Gone was the broken creature from the auction house. In the presence of warriors who understood his pain, his military bearing returned. Not through fear or training. Harrison's response was immediate and violent. Take the dog. Now. His men moved fast. But Shadow moved faster. Years of combat training merged with newfound purpose. He met the first attacker head-on. Not with panic. Not with blind rage. But with precise, calculated strikes. Ethan moved in sync, his own military instincts flaring to life. Man and dog moved as one. A seamless defensive unit. Cooper's veterans responded in kind, forming a perimeter. Calm, tactical, experience. And suddenly, Harrison's men found themselves trapped. The trap they thought they were setting was now closing around them. It's over, Major, Cooper called out. We've documented everything. Your methods. The eliminated dogs. The cover-ups. It's all coming out. At your demonstration. Then, Harrison did something no one expected. He reached into his coat and pulled out a familiar training device. A shock collar. The same kind he used to break dogs like Shadow. Shadow's reaction was immediate, but not what anyone anticipated. He didn't flinch. Didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped forward. Placed himself between Harrison and Ethan. His stance, unshakable. A silent challenge. Still think you can control him? Ethan asked. Voice low, unwavering. He's not your weapon anymore. He never was. He's a soldier. And he's chosen his side. The distant wail of sirens finally broke the standoff. Red and blue lights painted the fields. Harrison and his men backed away, retreating to their vehicles. But as he stepped inside, Harrison turned, and his final words were laced with venom. This isn't over, Walker. That dog knows too much. And so do you. As police cars flooded the property, Shadow held his position, eyes locked on Harrison's vehicle as it disappeared into the distance. But there was no fear. Only steady, silent vigilance. The bearing of a warrior who had finally found his purpose. The morning of Harrison's demonstration dawned cold and clear. The private training facility outside Helena sprawled across 30 acres. Its sleek, modern buildings, a harsh contrast to the wild Montana terrain that surrounded it. Military observers, private contractors, foreign representatives, all gathered in the viewing area, unaware of what was about to unfold. Ethan and Shadow arrived early, parking behind the maintenance building as planned. Agent Reynolds had secured them credentials. Through his ongoing investigation, Ethan was listed as a potential client. Shadow wore a new tactical vest provided by James Cooper. He moved with absolute calm. Even here, in a place that reeked of old ghosts. Remember, Ethan said quietly, adjusting his tie. We only need 15 minutes. Just long enough for Sarah to distribute the evidence. And Reynolds to ID the key players. Shadow didn't flinch. His gaze locked on the demonstration area, where handlers were preparing the dogs. Then, his posture shifted. Subtly. Sharply. He recognized something. A scent. A sound. Other military dogs. Some, maybe from his own unit. Dr. Thompson's voice crackled through their earpiece. She was monitoring from a van parked nearby. Harrison's security is doing perimeter sweeps, she said. Stay in position until the demo starts. The viewing stands began to fill. Ethan scanned the crowd. High-ranking military brass. Private security heads. Even foreign defense reps. Harrison's reach went deeper than they thought. Sarah Baker, disguised as a journalist, moved through the crowd. Her camera concealed the transmitter streaming everything to Reynolds' team. At precisely 9 o'clock, Major Harrison stepped onto the stage. Tailored suit. Polished smile. Every inch the polished executive. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice boomed. Today, you'll witness the future of tactical canine training. He began listing stats. Success rates. Performance records. But Shadow wasn't listening. Suddenly, his ears snapped forward. He heard something. Or sensed it. Ethan followed his gaze toward a row of kennels behind the main building. Claire, he whispered into the mic. We need eyes on the back kennels. I'm pulling security feeds now, she replied. Then her voice shifted, urgent. Ethan, they're moving dogs out the back. Looks like they're trying to eliminate evidence. Shadow was already moving. His stride was smooth, silent, purposeful. Ethan followed without hesitation. They rounded the building and reached the kennel area, just as two handlers were loading a sedated German shepherd into a van. "Stand down!" Ethan commanded. His voice was sharp, heavy with military authority. "Federal investigation in progress." The handlers froze, uncertain. Then they looked at Shadow, and something in his posture stopped them cold. This wasn't a dog. This was a soldier. A presence they couldn't ignore. These men weren't Harrison's elite. They were ordinary handlers, following orders. One of them slowly lowered his tranquilizer gun. "These dogs are scheduled for retirement," the handler stammered, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Major's orders." "Retirement?" Ethan stepped forward. He gestured toward Shadow. "Like this one?" Shadow stood tall beside him, still, unmoving. "Check his ID number," Ethan said. "Look up what happened to him after Harrison labeled him retired." The younger handler squinted, stepped closer. "Wait," he breathed. "Is that Rex? They told us he was euthanized due to combat stress." Shadow didn't move, but his gaze locked onto the sedated shepherd in the van. His entire body spoke one message: not again. Not another one. Then a voice cut through the silence. Cold, close, controlled. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Harrison rounded the corner, two security personnel in tow. He stopped short at the sight of Shadow, and for a split second, his polished facade cracked. Then, he recovered. Well, he said. "I wondered when you'd make your move, Walker. Though I must admit, I expected something more dramatic." "No dramatics needed, Major," Ethan replied evenly. "Just the truth. The dogs you've eliminated. The evidence you've buried. The lives you've destroyed." Harrison chuckled dismissively, but his eyes never left Shadow. "And who's going to believe you?" he sneered. "A damaged veteran with PTSD. And a washed-out dog." What happened next silenced the entire scene. Shadow stepped forward and sat back straight, eyes steady. Every inch of him is a military working dog. No fear, no aggression, just discipline, dignity, truth. The handler nearest the van stepped back, realization dawning on his face. "Sir," he said quietly, looking at Harrison, "what exactly are we doing with these retired dogs?" The question hung in the air, and it marked the beginning of the end for Harrison's carefully manufactured empire. The commotion behind the kennels had drawn attention. Several military observers, noticing the delay in the demo, had begun making their way toward the scene. Harrison saw them, and for the first time, his confidence faltered. He turned quickly, voice smooth, trying to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. We're dealing with a disgruntled former client. Security will handle the matter." That's when Agent Reynolds stepped forward, his FBI badge on full display. "Actually, Major Harrison won't be handling anything." He turned to the growing crowd. "I apologize, But this demonstration is now part of an active federal investigation. The crowd rippled with shock. Then, Sarah Baker emerged from among them. No longer posing as a journalist. She carried a thick folder of documents. "These are training records," she said. Her voice is calm, clear, unwavering. "They show exactly what happens to dogs that don't meet the major standards." Harrison's security team moved to intercept her. But they stopped. When they saw Shadow, the German Shepherd stood between them and Sarah. His posture is firm, unyielding, military bearing, undeniable. Several foreign observers began recording with their phones. Sarah didn't stop. "My husband, Lieutenant Michael Baker, documented everything," she said. "The abuse, the cover-ups, the systematic elimination of dogs. That could expose the truth." Then, Dr. Thompson stepped into view, carrying her own evidence. "Medical records," she said, "clear and concise, of every dog who passed through Harrison's program. And didn't come out whole. These animals didn't fail training." Dr. Thompson said calmly to the stunned audience, "They were deliberately broken. When they showed signs of abuse, they were labeled unstable and eliminated." The younger handler, the one from the kennels, stepped forward. Face pale, voice unsteady. "Sir," he addressed the ranking officers present, "for months, we have been sedating and transporting dogs for retirement. But they never reached the retirement facilities." For the first time, Harrison's composure cracked. "These dogs are military assets," he snapped. "Their handling is a matter of national security. You have no right to interfere with authorized training protocols." "Authorized?" James Cooper's voice rang out. He stepped from the crowd, leaning on his cane, and projected photos onto the large demonstration screen. The images that followed. It was horrific. Training sessions, pain compliance drills, dogs muzzled, shocked, restrained. Several observers turned away, some visibly shaken. But Shadow, still seated in his formal military posture, held every eye. From a broken auction dog to a proud military working dog, he was the proof they couldn't deny. "This animal," Ethan said, stepping forward, "was one of your top-tier working dogs. 3 combat tours, multiple commendations." Then he started showing signs of trauma. Under Major Harrison's enhanced training, he was labeled unstable, scheduled for euthanasia. Before we intervened, Harrison made one last attempt to seize control. "That dog is unstable," he shouted. "Watch." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a high-frequency training device. It had once been used to torture dogs into submission. The sound pierced the air. Shadow's ears flattened. But he didn't move. He didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to Ethan, waiting for guidance. "That's the difference, Major," Ethan said quietly. "He's not responding to fear anymore. He's choosing to stand his ground." Military police moved in, summoned by the senior officers present. As they approached, Harrison panicked. He pulled a concealed weapon. "These dogs are my property," he snarled. "My program. My reputation." But Shadow moved first. Faster than anyone could track. Years of training, now driven by clarity and purpose. He disarmed Harrison with precision. No aggression. No chaos. Just calm, controlled takedown. The very skills Harrison tried to erase through fear. now saving lives. As Harrison was handcuffed and taken into custody, Dr. Thompson's team examined the sedated dogs. Each one. Now I have a chance to heal. To walk the same road Shadow had. The senior military observer, a decorated general, stepped forward. We had no idea, he said gravely. The reports we received. He looked at Shadow, and his voice softened. This ends today. All of it. Sarah Baker stood nearby, clutching her husband's documents. She looked at Shadow and smiled through tears. Mike would be proud, she whispered. You finished what he started. But the day wasn't over. A sharp cry pierced the air. One of the recently released dogs, still dazed from sedation. I panicked. The young shepherd bolted from the exam area, toward the facility's fence, toward the busy highway beyond. Without hesitation, Shadow turned to Ethan. Their eyes met. No words needed. Ethan gave a single nod, and Shadow ran. Years of tactical movement took over. But this time, it was not duty. It was not a command. It was compassion. The pursuing handler slowed, watching the older dog sprint ahead. Strong, clear-eyed, unbreakable. Shadow reached the frightened shepherd just before the fence, blocking its path, lowering his body, offering calm. It worked. The younger dog paused, panting, trembling, then moved back toward the safety of the facility, guided by a veteran who had once been broken and now stood whole again. The two young dogs stumbled into the arms of waiting handlers, safe, but Shadow remaining inside, trapped. The smoke thickened with every passing moment. Through the flames, Ethan could just make out his silhouette, searching, refusing to give up. He's not going to make it, someone shouted. The roof's about to collapse. Ethan surged forward. I'm going in. But James Cooper grabbed his arm. Wait, he said quietly, eyes locked on the inferno. Watch. In a display of intelligence and resilience that had once made him one of the military's best, Shadow located a weak point in the kennel's rear wall. Then, with everything he had left, he hurled his body against it. Again. And again. Until the structure finally gave way, and he emerged. Singed. Breathing hard. But alive. He made it just a few yards from the building, before collapsing to the ground. Moments later, the structure caved in completely behind him. Dr. Thompson rushed to his side. Emergency kit is already open. Smoke inhalation is severe, she said. Burns along his left side. We need to get him to a facility. Now. They loaded him into the truck. Ethan never left his side, cradling his head in his lap, whispering to him, the way he once did beneath desert skies. Don't you dare give up. We've come too far, Shadow, too far. The dog's eyes, though clouded with pain, never left Ethan's. That same unwavering loyalty. Still there. Still holding on. At the emergency veterinary hospital, the waiting room became a vigil. Ethan sat in silence, his military composure unraveling, one breath at a time. His hands, still streaked with soot, trembled as he stared at the ER doors. Dr. Thompson emerged now and then. Her voice is calm, but soft. He's fighting hard. The next 24 hours are critical. The smoke damage is extensive. But he's receiving the best care possible. Sarah Baker arrived quietly. In her hands, Lieutenant Baker's old service flag. Without a word, she draped it over Ethan's shoulders. And that broke something inside him. For the first time since returning from combat, Ethan Walker wept openly. "I failed him," he whispered. His voice cracked with grief. "Just like I failed my team in Afghanistan. I should have stopped him from going into that building." James Cooper stood nearby. He placed a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. "That's not what happened, son." His voice was calm, quiet, unshakable. "Shadow made a choice. The same choice any soldier would make. For his brothers in arms. You didn't fail him. You gave him back his purpose." All through the night, veterans filtered through the clinic. They brought coffee, food that went untouched. But most importantly, they brought silence. The kind of silence only another warrior understands. The silence of standing watch. For a brother. In the early hours of morning, Dr. Thompson found Ethan alone. He stood at the observation window, eyes locked on the still figure inside. Shadow lay motionless, connected to tubes and monitors. That once mighty frame, now fragile beneath layers of medical equipment. "You know," Claire said softly, "when you first brought him to the ranch, I wasn't sure either of you would survive. But I watched you heal each other. Watched you give each other a reason to keep fighting." She placed a hand on Ethan's arm. "That dog's not just fighting for himself in there. He's fighting to get back to you." As the sun began to rise, Shadow's vitals suddenly dropped. Emergency staff rushed into the room. Through the glass, Ethan stood frozen, helpless. Every memory flashed through his mind. Shadow's first steps toward trust. Their nights under Montana stars. The bond they built. From broken pieces. "I can't do this without you, buddy," Ethan whispered. His hand pressed against the glass. "We were supposed to heal together. Remember?" What happened next transformed the clinic into a command center of hope. Mark Wilson organized volunteer shifts, ensuring someone was always there. For Shadow, and for Ethan. Dr. Thompson coordinated with specialists statewide, launching an innovative smoke inhalation protocol. When equipment costs soared, the community responded immediately. 9-year-old Emma Lewis led the charge. She convinced her school to launch a fundraiser. "Save our Shadow." Posters went up in shop windows. Donation jars filled across town. The veteran community mobilized. With military precision, James Cooper reached out to his network. Within hours, assistance poured in. Military veterinarians, retired K-9 handlers. Even an Air Force med team volunteered to fly in critical supplies. Sheriff Davidson stationed deputies at the clinic. "This dog protected our community," he said. "Now it's our turn to protect him." Patricia Martinez organized a candlelight vigil. The parking lot filled with quiet figures. People of every faith, every background, united by one story. One dog. Shadow. Sarah Baker worked with local media. Her coverage sparked national attention. People across the country began to ask, "How do we treat the dogs who serve? What do we owe them when the war ends?" Legislators took notice. Veterans testified. And change began to stir. On the third day, Dr. Thompson stood before the crowd. Her voice trembled with emotion. The equipment you helped us obtain, the 24/7 care you supported, it's made all the difference. That evening, it happened. Shadow's vital signs stabilized. And for the first time, he woke up. Ethan was finally allowed inside. He approached slowly, heart pounding, and then, a sound. Thump. Shadow's tail moved. Weak, but unmistakable. His eyes fluttered open, and found Ethan. Look at all these people here for you, buddy, Ethan whispered, voice cracking. He gestured toward the window. A whole town of battle buddies, waiting on you. Claire Thompson wiped away tears as she watched the reunion. This, she said to the crowd, this is more than just a dog recovering. This is proof. Military working dogs, removed from service, declared unfit, quietly euthanized. Agent Reynolds let the word settle. His voice is steady, but heavy with the weight of truth. In reality, they weren't failures. They were silenced. Because they displayed independence. Because they wouldn't break. Because they trusted their instincts. More than the orders forced upon them. The room fell quiet. The truth laid bare. Harrison's program hadn't been a revolution in training. It was a systematic machine of erasure. And Shadow's survival had brought the entire structure down. Ethan sat with Shadow's head resting in his lap. The dog, still weak from his injuries, looked up at his partner. The bond between them, now unshakable. They were no longer just soldiers and dogs. No longer rescuer and rescued. They were brothers in arms, linked by memory, by sacrifice, by a mission that had cost so much, but saved even more. Sarah Baker handed Ethan her husband's journal. This was Mike's last entry, she said softly. He wrote about some acts of courage. Can't be measured by human standards. That sometimes, the truest loyalty, is the kind that defies orders. To do what's right. Ethan nodded, eyes misted. He turned to Shadow and placed a hand on his head. All this time, I thought I carried that day alone, he whispered. But you were there. You tried to save them. Just like you saved me. Shadow's tail moved. Barely. But it was enough. The hearing ended with sweeping reforms. The military's K-9 program was placed under new oversight. Strict laws were passed to protect working dogs, ensure proper retirement care, and ban aggressive training methods like those used by Harrison. Shadow's name became a permanent fixture in those reforms. A symbol, not of trauma, but survival, of courage without command, and loyalty without condition. Back in Montana, as weeks passed, Shadow's strength slowly returned. He would never be the same physically. But what he lost in speed, he gained something far more powerful. Legacy. A year later, a plaque was unveiled outside the newly built Shadow Recovery Center for retired military dogs. It read, in honor of Rex, !Shadow, who disobeyed flawed orders, to do what was right. The ceremony was quiet, but the crowd was vast. Veterans, children, handlers, and dogs. They all came, not just to honor a hero, but to witness the proof. That moment showed the world something important. That when a community comes together, when we refuse to give up on those who served, remarkable healing is possible. The road to recovery would be long. But Shadow would not walk it alone. The people who had rallied behind him and Ethan had proven something powerful: that the bonds forged in adversity can strengthen not just individuals, but entire communities. During Shadow's recovery, Agent Reynolds returned to the clinic. He carried a classified military file. "This," he said, laying it on the table, "changes everything." The document, recently declassified as part of the Harrison investigation, contained the full details of Shadow's final mission in Kandahar. "This report was buried," Reynolds explained. "Intentionally. It explains why Harrison worked so hard to erase Shadow." The truth was this: during Ethan's final deployment, Shadow had been assigned to Lieutenant Baker's unit for a high-risk reconnaissance operation, and Shadow had detected signs of an ambush well before it occurred. But his handler at the time, acting under Major Harrison's direct orders, ignored the warnings. Harrison was obsessed with proving his enhanced methods worked. He forced Shadow forward, ignoring clear signs of distress. The report revealed that Shadow broke free from his handler and ran to Baker's unit on his own. His act, though against orders, saved lives. But it also exposed Harrison's methods. Shadow proved that instinct, trust, and proper training were far more effective than forced obedience, and that threatened Harrison's empire. Dr. Thompson, reviewing Shadow's original records, added another piece to the puzzle. "His injuries that day," she said softly, "weren't just from the ambush. Some were inflicted afterward, during what Harrison called corrective training." Shadow, still recovering, lay nearby, but his eyes locked on Ethan. The German shepherd's gaze seemed deeper now, wiser, more than just loyalty. It was understanding. Lieutenant Baker's final report, written the day before his death, held a single, handwritten note. "Shadow's actions today reflect the highest principles of military service. Disobeying flawed orders to save human lives. That is not failure. That is heroism." Ethan read it in silence, then rested his hand on Shadow's head. "You were trying to protect them," he whispered. "Just like you protected those dogs in the fire. That's who you've always been." Reynolds stepped forward. "This changes everything. With this, we can push for a complete overhaul of the military working dog program. Shadow's story will ensure that no other dog suffers the way he did." "All this time," Ethan said quietly, looking at Shadow, "I've carried the guilt of not preventing what happened to our team. But you knew. You tried to warn them." Shadow lifted his head, despite the pain, and looked at him. They weren't just two wounded warriors. They were survivors of the same battle. Sarah placed Lieutenant Baker's journal in Ethan's hands. "Mike's last entry was about Shadow," she said. "He wrote, 'Some acts of courage can't be measured by human standards. Sometimes, the truest loyalty is defying orders to do what's right.'" The full scope of Harrison's crimes came to light during a formal military review board hearing. Agent Reynolds presented the timeline. It revealed a systematic effort to conceal the truth about the military K-9 program. 2 sets of records. One, shown to military oversight. Polished, clean. The other, hidden. full of redacted reports. And disappearing dogs. Dogs that failed to conform weren't listed as failures, Reynolds testified. They were erased. Our investigation uncovered 43 cases of healthy, trained dogs, labeled unstable, and quietly eliminated. But not Shadow. Shadow survived. And because he did, everything changed. Fate had one more truth to reveal. It came in the form of a journal. Lieutenant Baker's personal notebook. Brought in by Sarah. Its pages yellowed, but filled with clarity. This, she said softly, is the missing piece. Mike had written about that day in Kandahar. In stunning detail. Sarah's voice held steady as she read. He described how Shadow's behavior shifted, becoming increasingly agitated, pulling at his lead, trying to steer his handler away from a specific route. At the time, they thought it was aggression. But minutes later, when the first gunshots rang out, they understood. Shadow wasn't just warning us, Ethan whispered. Reading the words, he was trying to lead them to the fallback point we had secured. Mike's journal confirmed it. Shadow's actions saved lives that day, but at a cost. He had been injured shielding soldiers during the ambush, protecting them with his own body. And for that, he was punished. Instead of receiving a commendation, Shadow was branded disobedient and reassigned to Harrison's program. Dr. Thompson, flipping through the medical reports, added the final blow. The abuse started almost immediately afterward, she said. Some of his worst injuries were from corrective training, not combat. For Ethan, the truth hit hard. All this time, he murmured, I've carried the guilt of not being able to stop what happened that day. But you knew. He looked at Shadow. You tried to warn them. And no one listened. Shadow, still weak from the fire, lifted his head. And in that shared gaze was understanding. They weren't just two wounded souls who found each other. They were survivors of the same battle, connected by sacrifice and silenced truth. Sarah handed Ethan the final page of Mike's journal. This was his last entry, she said. He read the words slowly. Some acts of courage can't be measured by human standards. Sometimes the truest form of loyalty means defying orders to do what's right. Then came the formal military review board hearing. Agent Reynolds presented the evidence. A comprehensive timeline that revealed a systematic effort to conceal the truth. Harrison had built two reporting systems. One, clean, polished, was presented to oversight. The other, hidden, encrypted, told the real story. A story of abuse, manipulation, and destruction. The program's success rate, Reynolds testified, was artificially inflated. Dogs that resisted didn't count as failures. They disappeared. The investigation identified 43 healthy, fully trained dogs, labeled unstable, and quietly eliminated. For showing independence, for trusting instinct, for resisting fear-based conditioning. Senior military officials listened in silence. Many had been unaware of how far the deception had spread. Harrison had bypassed oversight, built a closed system where natural protective instincts were seen as threats. Dr. Thompson stepped forward. She held up a scan of Shadow's brain activity. These dogs weren't retrained, she said. They were broken, This wasn't behavior correction. It was systematic torture, designed to replace instinct with fear. Then came the most damning piece. Harrison's own communications. Private messages, outlining a calculated effort to eliminate dogs, whistleblowers, and anyone who questioned his methods, including Mike Baker. Lieutenant Baker's death had been convenient. It allowed Harrison to bury the truth and silence the dog who tried to expose it. Shadow. More whistleblowers come forward. Former trainers, administrators, even veterinarians. They describe how data had been manipulated, injuries hidden, dogs discarded, and contracts signed with the blood of silent warriors. The program reached beyond a training facility. It touched procurement contracts, veterinary systems, even deployment decisions. But in the end, Shadow's story changed everything. It became the catalyst for a complete, irreversible overhaul of the military working dog program. The Military Review Board made their final decision. New oversight protocols were implemented immediately. Independent veterinary monitoring became mandatory, and whistleblower protections were extended to handlers and veterinarians alike. But perhaps the most powerful voice in that room was Shadow's. He stood proudly beside Ethan, fully recovered, a living testament to what was possible. From a condemned auction dog to a national symbol of reform. 6 months later, Ethan's quiet Montana ranch had transformed. Now called the Second Chance K9 Rehabilitation Center. It became the first facility of its kind. A place where retired military working dogs and their handlers could heal together. Under Dr. Thompson and James Cooper's guidance, the center pioneered a new approach. Not dominance, no command, but connection. Shadow played a central role. His calm presence, his patience, his scars, all became tools in guiding traumatized dogs back to trust. Their first breakthrough came with a Belgian Malinois named Scout. He was scheduled for euthanasia, declared unfit for civilian life, until Shadow stepped in. Within weeks, Scout bonded with a retired Marine suffering from PTSD. Together, they completed their journey. These dogs don't need to be retrained, Ethan told visiting military veterinarians. They need to be remembered for who they were before the trauma. The results were undeniable. Over 90% of dogs who completed the program successfully transitioned to civilian life. Some became therapy dogs. Others joined law enforcement. Many simply found home. Sarah Baker took on the role of outreach coordinator. She shared her husband's original documentation to help shape new training protocols. Mike believed in the bond between handler and dog, she said. This center proves he was right. Shadow, now older, moved through the facility with quiet authority. New arrivals instinctively followed his lead, drawn by something deeper than training, a wisdom born of suffering and survival. Dr. Thompson documented his behavior. Shadow adapts his approach to each dog, as if he understands their pain instinctively. He's proof that emotional intelligence in working dogs is far greater than we ever imagined. His influence reached far beyond Montana. The reforms inspired by Shadow's journey reshaped national policy. The military implemented the Shadow Protocol. Mandatory psychological evaluations, independent training audits, formal retirement programs. A new law was passed. The Military Working Dog Protection Act, guaranteeing care, funding, and ethical treatment long after service ends. The ripple effect continued. Major military training centers adopted new methods. International delegations studied the Montana model, implementing reforms of their own. Costs went down. Service life extended. And dogs thrived. Ethan and Shadow's testimony before Congress became historic. Not because of statistics, but because of what they represented. Healing, loyalty, and hope. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn morning, Ethan and Shadow stood once more at the edge of their ranch, watching new veterans arrive, with new dogs and old wounds. The original barn, now a state-of-the-art center, but Shadow's favorite spot, remaining the quiet corner, where he and Ethan first learned to trust again. The method they pioneered became known as the Shadow Walker Method. Parallel healing, human and canine, together. Medical journals published studies. Veterans reported breakthrough recovery rates. And still, every day, Shadow walked the perimeter, with steady steps, and eyes that had seen both war and peace. The annual Shadows Run brought veterans, handlers, and families from across the country to honor the bond, to celebrate second chances, and to say, "Thank you." One morning, Ethan and Shadow met a young veteran, struggling with his newly assigned therapy dog. Without a word, Shadow approached, sat beside them, and waited. The veteran would later say, "That moment restored my faith in recovery." Letters poured in. Stories, thanks, from lives touched by the program, from handlers who found healing, and from dogs who finally knew safety. As the sun set behind the Montana mountains, Ethan and Shadow sat side by side on the porch where it all began, watching the legacy unfold. The once broken dog had become a healer, a guide, a guardian. Together, they had turned pain into purpose and proven one unshakable truth: even the deepest wounds can heal, with compassion, with patience, and with unwavering loyalty. In the harshest moments of life, Shadow and Ethan's story reminds us that healing knows no species, no rank, no age, only the courage to begin again. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If it touched you, leave a like and let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. We'll see you in the next video.